Okay, this is going to be the advanced math review for trig functions for 2018. Let's go through some of these properties first. Okay, amplitude here will be 2. The period, what you're going to do is do 2 pi divided by the number in front of x. So that would be 2 pi over 3. There is no phase shift, there is no vertical shift. On this one, the amplitude will be 5. The period would be 2 pi divided by 2, which would be 1 pi. There'd be no phase shift, no vertical shift. Okay? Now, as far as these go, all right, let me go through to a blank page so I can show you. Your angles are always going to be this. Okay? Now, your values are determined on the trig function. Okay? Let me make sure you can see that okay. Fantastic. Okay? The idea behind the values are if you took the points 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, 0, negative 1. Okay? And this is 0 and 2 pi, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. Okay? So when you do cosine, okay, so if you do cosine, cosine would be, if I was doing cosine, you might want to write these down. Cosine would be 1 over 1, because what we assume cosine is x over r. R is always equal to 1, okay? This is always, okay? So 1 over 1 would just be 1. At pi over 2, the x coordinate is 0, r is 1, so that would be 0. Okay? At pi, it would be negative 1 over 1, which would be negative 1. And 3 pi over 2, the x is 0. So these are the values for cosine, and I'll be going through those each time. So for all intents and purposes, you should have those written down. Now, when you do sine, okay, when you do sine, that will be y over r. So this would be 0 over 1, which would be 0 here. Pi over 2 would be 1 over 1, which would be 1. Pi would be 0 over 1, which would be 0. And then negative, or 3 pi over 2 would be negative 1 over 1, which is negative 1. Okay? Now, when you look, so that's the ones for sine. Now, when you look at tangent, okay, tangent is a little bit different. Okay? So for tangent, the period is smaller. Okay? All right, so in tangent, we go 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. Now for tangent, that would be y over x. Okay, so the y here at 0 would be 0. Okay, let me move that out of the way, hold on. So for tangent is y over x. So at the y would be 0, the x would be 1, so that would be 0. At pi over 2, the y is 1, the x is 0, so that's undefined. Okay, and then at pi, the y is 0, the x is negative 1, which is 0. Okay? Now, for pi over 4, and we did this in class, this will be pi, this will be 1 and negative 1. Reason being that in the 45-degree triangle, tangent is square root of 2 over the square root of 2, which is 1. And if you go over to 3 pi over 4, it ends up being negative 1. So those are the values for tangent. So as I go through, all right, I'm gonna assume that you know those. Okay? All right, so for this one, what I want to do is I want to take my angles. My angles are 0, 2 pi, all right, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. Okay, so what I'm going to do with my angles, because that 3, I'm going to divide all of my angles by 3. All right, for my values, what I'm going to do, my values are going to start at 1, 0, negative, no, I'm sorry, it's sine. So for sine, the values are going to start at 0, 1, 0, negative 1. okay? All right, now I'm sort of really running out of room here to do this. So what I'm going to do, that's what you would start with, okay? All right, that's what you would start with for those, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my angles, I'm going to divide them by 3. My values are going to be times 2. So what I do pretty simply is I'm going to do 0 divided by 3, which is 0, okay? And then 2 divided by 3, which is, 2 divided by 3, which is 2/3 pi. So the angles will be 0 and 2/3 pi. Okay, for pi over 2 is going to be 1/2 as a fraction. So I'm going to do 1 over 2 divided by 3. I get 1/6 pi, so pi over 6. For pi, that's 1 divided by 3, which will be 1/3, so 1/3 pi. Okay, and then 3 pi over 2. I'm going to divide by 3, and I get pi over 2. Okay, so for my values, this will be 2, this will be 0, this will be negative 2, and this will be 0. Okay, so what I'm going to do, all right, I got pi over 2, all right, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. All right, so what I would do is at 0, I'm going to graph 2. Okay, now what you can do is have the idea that these are 45s. Okay, so that's like a quarter. Okay, so these are that'll be 1/4, 3/4, 5/4, and 7/4. Okay, they go in that regard. Okay, so then I would, at pi over 6, which is 30 degrees, I'd be at 0. Okay, at pi over 3, I'd be down at -2. At pi over 2, I'd be at 0. And then 2/3 pi would be back here, so this would be my graph. Okay? Over here for sine, okay, what's going to happen is I'm going to take my angles, and I'm going to divide all of my angles by 2, and my values for sine, I'm going to multiply by 5. Okay? So, pretty simple. Okay? Take those angles that we started with. 0 over 2 is 0. 2 divided by 2 would be 1. So that's going to be 0 and 1 pi. Okay. Then I would have a pi over 2, which is really 1/2. 1/2 divided by 2 is 1/4. So pi over 4. Okay. 1 pi divided by 2 is 1/2. Okay, and then 3 pi over 2, divided by 2 is 3/4. Okay, so for the values, we're dealing with sine again. So it's very similar. I'm going to multiply all of those. I gave the wrong values for these. Hold on. We're dealing with sine here. Sorry. That would be 0. I'm sorry, 2, 0. Okay, -2. All right. Okay, so, sorry. Let me get rid of this. See if I can get rid of this curve here. Okay. All right. Whoops. So, the curve on this last one should have been 0. Okay. I should have been like this. The blue curve will be that. Sorry. Will be at 0. Okay, pi over 2, I should have been at -2. And then 2 pi over 3 back at 0. So sorry, this should have been the blue curve. The blue curve actually should have been what I had. Okay, so this one should be 0, 5, 0, -5. Okay. All right. So I start with 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay. So what I'll have is I'll have quarters. My quarters are halfway between. So at 0, I'm at 0. At pi over 4, which would be this quarter, should probably make that a little bit better, more towards the middle. Okay, at this quarter, I'll be at 5. Okay, at pi over 2, I'm at 0. Okay, at 3 pi over 4, which would be this one, I'm down at -5. And then back at pi, I'm at 0. All right, so this is what this looks like. Okay, sorry about that first example. That was a mistake. Okay, all right. Moving on to these problems. Okay, all right. So my amplitude would be 1 here. I would do 2 pi divided by a half, which 2 divided by a half, because you divide by the number that's in front of x. That will be 4 pi. There will be no phase shift. The vertical shift here will be 2. Okay? All right, so my angles, all right? My angles, what's going to happen is I'm going to divide by a half. My values are going to be times by -1, and then I'm going to add 2 to the values. Okay? So what I would have here, 0 divided by a half. Okay, which is 0. Okay, I would have 2 divided by a half. Which is 4. Okay, so 0 and 4 pi. Okay. Okay, then I would do pi over 2, so 1/2, divided by a half. Sorry, my calculator's being all kinds of crazy. That's 1 pi. Then I got 1 divided by a half. 2, okay, and then 3 halves divided by a half. Which would be 3 pi. So those would be my angles. My values for cosine are going to be 1 times -1 plus 2. So my first value will be 3. Okay, then I do 0 times -1 plus 2, that'll be 2. Okay, then I'm going to do -1 times -1 plus 2, be 3. Okay, and then I'm going to do, whoops, hold on, that one's not right, it can't be right. That should be negative, wait, hold on, that one's not right. Sorry, that would be, delete all this. Be negative, it would be 1 times -1 plus 2. Sorry, that should be 1. And then the last one is 0 times -1 plus 2. Okay. All right, so when I make this, what I should do, 0, I normally do pi over 2, okay, I normally do pi, 3 pi over 2, okay, 2 pi. Now as you can see, this fraction keeps continuing. So what I'm going to have to do is 5 pi over 2, okay, 3 pi, 7 pi over 2, and 4 pi. If you notice, all the fractions always work in odd increments. So at 0, I'm going to be at 1. At 1 pi, I'm going to be at 2. At 2 pi, I'm going to be at 3. At 3 pi, I'm going to be back at 2. Okay? And then back at 4 pi, I'm at 1. So my curve looks like this. Okay? All right. Now this one right here, what's going to happen? Sorry. All right, what's going to happen here is my amplitude will be 1. The period will be 2 pi divided by 1, which would just be 2 pi. The phase shift is opposite of what you see, so it's negative 3 pi over 2. And then the vertical shift is negative 3. So what's going to happen with your angles here? Okay, what's going to happen with your angles is you're going to subtract 3 over 2 pi. Okay, and then the values, okay, all right, since multiplying by 1 doesn't do anything, the only thing we're going to have here is we're going to have a subtraction of 3. So I'm dealing with cosine, okay, so 0 minus 3 halves, okay, and then 2 minus 3 halves, okay, so I got negative 3 halves and I got a half, negative 3 halves pi, and then pi over 2. Okay? Then I go pi over 1/2 minus 3 halves, and that's negative 1 pi. Okay? And then I go 1 minus 3 halves, which is negative 1/2 pi. Okay, and then I go 3 halves minus 3 halves to get 0. Okay, my values, okay, since I'm dealing with cosine, my first value is 1. 1 minus 3 is negative 2. Okay, and then I got 0. Minus 3 is negative 3. Okay. Then I got negative 1. Minus 3 is negative 4. And finishing with the same 0. 0 basically going to give you the same result each time. Negative 3. Okay. I'm going to erase this past example. Okay, to give you some more room. Okay. Now, as you can see, I have negative angles here. So normally I'm pi over 2. As you can see, I don't got anything that goes past pi over 2. So over here, what I can do is I can go negative pi over 2. Okay, then I got negative pi. And I got negative 3 pi over 2. Okay, so as I plot this, I got negative 3 pi over 2 is negative 2. For color, just so you can see where the dot is. Okay. At negative 1 pi, I'm down at negative 3. Hold on one second. This is frustrating. Okay, so I'm down at negative 3. Okay, at negative pi of 2, I'm down at negative 4. Okay, at 0, I'm back at negative 3. And then pi over 2, I'm back at negative 2. So this is what my curve looks like. Okay. All right, moving on to question number 5. Okay. All right. Now, what's going to happen here? Amplitude will be 3. Period will be 2 pi over 1, which will be just 2 pi. Phase shift will be negative pi over 4. Vertical shift will be 1. So, just to make this a little bit cleaner, my angles are going to be subtracted by pi over 4. My values, okay, all right, I'll put the angles and then the values. It might make this a little bit easier. My values are going to be multiplied by 3 and then added by 1. Okay? So 0 minus pi over 4, or 1/4, is negative 1/4 pi, or negative pi over 4. Okay? And then 2 minus 1/4 is 7/4 pi. Okay? Then I'm going to have a half minus 1/4, which would be 1/4 pi, or pi over 4. I'm going to put them right on the line so you can see them. Okay? Then I got 1 minus 1/4, which would be 3/4 pi. All right, and then the last one will be 3/2 minus 1/4. 5/4 pi. Okay? So those are the angles. Okay, now below I'm going to put them on these lines so you can see. So what I'm going to do, this is cosine, so this is going to be times 3 plus 1. So 1 times 3 plus 1. Okay, first one's going to be 4. Then it's 0 times 3 plus 1. That will be 1. Then negative 1 times 3 plus 1 will be negative 2. And then 0 times 3 plus 1. Whoops, 0 times 3 plus 1. Okay, so as I graph this, okay, all right, I would have, let's go pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Okay, so I'm going to use a little color of red for my quarters. All right, I'm going to plot with blue. So I got to go back actually and go, because I got a negative angle, negative pi over 2. Okay, I'm going to plot in blue, so at negative pi over 2, I'm at 4. Or negative pi over 4, I'm at 4. Okay, then at pi, I'm at 1. Pi over 4, I'm at 1. Okay, at 3 pi over 4, I'm at negative 2. At 5 pi over 4, I'm at 1. And 7 pi over 4, I'm back here. So the idea is, this is like a quarter, this is 3/4, this is 5/4, this is 7/4. Okay, so this works in increments of 2, but they're in the odd context. So that will be your measure. Okay, now what you have to do first here in sine is you actually have to take out the 4 here. So this will be sine of 4, and you divide both of these things by 4. So that'd be x plus pi over 4 minus 2. Okay, so your amplitude will be 4. Okay, all right, your amplitude will be 4. Your period would be 2 pi divided by 4, which would be pi over 2. Your phase shift will be negative pi over 4. Your vertical shift will be negative 2. Okay, let me write that above here so you guys can have it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase this. Okay, so that's what we're going to be graphing. So the first thing that's going to happen, my angles, all right, what's going to happen with those are they are going to be divided by 4. Sorry, my amplitude is not right. No, amplitude is not 4. Amplitude should be 1. Okay, and then I'm going to subtract pi over 4. Okay, so sorry, my phase shift, there you go. All right. Okay, so that's going to happen to my angles. Okay, so 0 divided by 4 minus 1/4. Okay, that's going to be negative pi over 4. Okay, then I got 2 divided by 4 minus a fourth. Okay, is going to be pi over 4. Okay, then I got a half